Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. Today is Sunday, May 23rd, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun by Jessica Russell. Catherine read her sister's letter with happiness, elation, and intense curiosity, devouring every word. She could not wait, but pulled her cloak about her and set off to the field where she knew Julian was inspecting the new trees with Lance and James. "Catherine, what the devil is wrong with you? You know you're not supposed to run all this way. Do you ever listen to Dr. Lincroft? I know you haven't so far, but do you ever plan to?" He dismounted and walked up to her. "Don't be angry, Julian. I have such news, and I really didn't run all this way, just this last part. I can't imagine what news could be so important that you couldn't wait to have a horse saddled." At this she produced a letter, saying, "But look, it's a letter from my sister Sabrina. I've waited so long to hear how things turned out with her. It seems she is well and happy with Armand. Darling, that's all wonderful news. However, you must ride back with me. This physical exertion is bad for you. I just couldn't wait until you returned to tell you. I was bursting. Aren't you interested? Don't you want to know about her and how it all turned out?" Fearing he had hurt her feelings and realizing that he should have shown more surprise, Catherine had no idea it was Julian who had sent the detective to France in the first place. He quickly said, "I am very interested, sweetheart. I do care about those things. Very much so. I am just concerned about this exertion which you know you should not indulge in. Come and let me take you home, and don't go running across the countryside from now on, no matter how excited you are about anything." She merely smiled and rolled and allowed him to help her mount his horse, knowing that it was useless to argue. Once they were on their way, she said, "I could have made it back perfectly fine. Well, whether that's true or not, I was not about to risk it. You need to follow the doctor's protocol once and for all, not let it slip your mind every time something excites you, and I mean it this time. No more fiascos like this." "Always a tyrant," she replied, leaning back against him, enjoying his concern for her. "I will do better," she said. "That I will believe when I see," Julian replied. "Catherine, I love you so. You must not scare me like this again." "I won't," she whispered, as if him telling her he loved her was the most natural thing in the world. "I promise. All the wall is crumbling. I can yet make her mine if I go carefully from here." The next day he sent for Ernest to provide his payment for a job well done. As he waited for the detective, he sat with a ledger, going over what goods and coin should be sent to France and what was best to try to conceal in the secret room off the library. Later, when he heard a knock on the study door, he assumed the man had come to collect his payment, but was surprised to find Edward standing there. "Please, sir," Edward said immediately, "forgive the intrusion, sir, but it is to you I must come with this issue, and it is rather time-sensitive. May I have a moment if it is convenient?" "Certainly," Julian said, and he motioned him in. "It is somewhat of a delicate matter, sir, but I understand that your housekeeper, Sarah Milford, is with child." "May I ask how you garnered this knowledge?" Julian asked, although without anger or irritation. He was merely curious as to how word had traveled so soon. "Suffice that I know," Edward said after a long pause, and Julian realized that perhaps Sarah told him herself. He waited then, because he had a feeling of what the man was about to say. "I was hoping to have your blessing to ask for her hand. Because of her, due to the situation, I thought it would be best to speak to you as soon as possible." "It is your child, then?" Julian asked, hoping he had not accused the wrong man when he went to Godfrey's, but inwardly laughing at the possibility. "No, the child belongs to Stephen Godfrey, sir, but we can pass it off as mine to help Sarah's reputation, if you have no objection to me doing so," he said frankly. "I will raise the child as mine. If it is not your child, and you have no obligation, I can only assume you love the girl?" "Yes, sir." "Well, then I am well pleased to offer my blessing, and I wish you both great happiness." Edward thanked him and departed rather abruptly, and Julian knew he was going to Sarah. The others were surprised when he told them about the marriage that would soon take place. "Edward the Puritan?" Richard asked with surprise. "No, his father, Reginald, is the staunch Puritan," Jennifer put in. "Indeed he is," Julian said. When speaking with Edward earlier, Julian had in fact asked him if it was not refreshing to finally be away from the man. At first Edward had looked at him sharply, believing that perhaps Julian was goading him, but saw nothing but goodwill on his face, and then admitted that he was indeed happy to be out of that household, and expressed his satisfaction with his position at the manor. Catherine was happiest of all, as she knew that Sarah would have had a difficult time bearing the child as an unmarried woman. No one would believe that the two had eloped months prior and kept it a secret, but they would all pretend to, and this would make it a bit easier. Danger. It was an unusually pleasant day for the last of November, and Matthew and Clarissa were outdoors. Matthew and some boys from the nearby estates were being taught to shoot by Lance. Pigeons had become a problem in the neighborhood, and Julian thought they might shoot at them, as it would be good practice to try their hand at moving targets. Catherine went to the rose garden to gather some of the newest flowers for a vase in the hall she especially loved. They were an unusual off-white shade, and she thought some of the loveliest she had ever seen. She was relishing the warmth of the sun, the bees buzzing, the scent of the flowers, and the sounds of the boys squealing and exclaiming at their target practice. Julian had come out to say hello and to tell the boys to take whatever pigeons they shot along to the cottages. He was eventually going to find Catherine, but stayed speaking to Lance for a few moments. On the other side of the house, Catherine had just gathered the last of the roses when she suddenly felt a sharp, intense pain and lost her balance, collapsing to the ground. All at once she realized a pellet had grazed her arm. She saw blood on her gown and knew the shooting must have gotten out of range. Concerned, she shakily got up and made her way around the hedgerow to alert Lance. But just before she could call to him, she fainted. Dimly she heard Matthew's voice saying, "It wasn't me. I didn't do it." Lance and Julian came running, having seen Catherine faint, and Julian carried her inside while Lance brought a halt to the shooting. "What happened?" cried Sarah, who had quickly come to the front lawn with Carintha. "The boys were shooting pigeons, and a shot got out of range," Julian answered. "Everyone should go indoors." Sarah and Lance immediately began to gather the children, and as Catherine recovered, she heard Matthew's voice again saying, "But I must speak to her. She must know I didn't do it." And it was then Catherine realized that one of the children's shots must have been that which grazed her arm as she reached for the roses. "Come, love," said Sarah gently, pulling Matthew away. "Don't cry. She knows you didn't do it." In the drawing room, Carintha came immediately to look at Catherine's wound. "It's only superficial. Her fainting was likely just due to the sight of the blood or the shock of the impact and the pain. Did it hurt terribly when it happened?" "Very intense for a few moments, and then just a sharp stinging pain now." Catherine reached out for Julian's hand, more so to calm him than to seek comfort. It was disconcerting to him, looking pale and shocked. "I truly am fine," she said. "I think Carintha is correct in her theory that it was nothing more than the impact of the pellet, the sight of the blood, and the surprise of it all. You know my heart doesn't like surprises." And she laughed lightly in an attempt to brighten the mood a bit. "How did it happen?" she asked. "What do you think, Julian?" asked Richard. "I don't know what to think. The boys were told to stay in line and shoot only in one direction, and we were right there watching them," he said, frowning. "But I suppose any of them could have gotten carried away and taken one last shot as a pigeon got out of range. It is just odd that we were both there and neither of us saw it, although Lance was shooting also at one point." "Could it have been Lance's shot that got out of range?" asked Richard. "I must admit it went awfully high and far for a child's shot," Julian replied, "but Lance is an expert marksman. His aim would never be that far off." Matthew was at the far end, but he is adamant that it was not him. Later, when Catherine was not nearby, Richard asked Julian if he thought Catherine's father would go that far. "I suppose I can't overlook the possibility," Julian replied, "but it seems odd that he would attempt such a thing in broad daylight. And where would he have concealed himself that no one saw him coming or going?" "A good point," said Richard, "and yet when something like this happens, there is usually such mayhem that it gives the person those few vital moments to escape unnoticed." Both men were disturbed at the possibility. Despite the unsolved mystery, however, things quickly went back to normal at Briarwood, and Catherine was no worse for the incident. One day, Carintha unexpectedly announced that she was going for a ride with Harold Montgomery, who was coming for her and the children at 2:00. "We thought it would be good for them to see some of the hawthorn and mahonia that grow wild in late fall, and Harold seems to know quite a bit about them. Then they can gather the last of the autumn flowers for the front room on their way back." Although Carintha tried to sound casual, the family suspected what the true reason for the outing was, as naturally Carintha knew far more about plants than Harold Montgomery. Therefore, it was clear that he was coming as an excuse to see her, and the children were essentially being used as chaperones. The family were secretly both amused and pleased, and made a point to act casually for the couple's sake. "Hawthorn is what you use for my heart push potions, is it not?" Catherine asked. "Yes, but only the berries." "I wish physicians would take more notice of it," she replied. "It helps the blood to circulate." Catherine smiled as she went back into the house, speculating, as were the rest of the family, about the apparent romance. They noticed Carinza was taking greater pains with her appearance also. Even as she stood there in her riding habit, the change was obvious. It was clearly one she recently had made in a fashionable cut, and unlike the usual somber shades she wore, it was a beautiful green that idly set off her coloring. Her hair was drawn back and caught with a ribbon of the same shade, but she had allowed a few strands to fall down around her face. Catherine thought she looked quite beautiful, and knew, of course, that the attention Harold had been bestowing on her was the reason. Later she told Julian how pleased she would be if the romance worked out. Julian agreed and added that Carinza seemed to be a natural with children, which was evident ever since she'd taken over the teaching of Clarissa and Matthew, and they discussed how nice it would be if she married and had a family of her own. They watched from one of the windows on the second floor as they rode out. "It's supposed to be foggy today, though," Catherine said. "I hope they are careful to return before dusk." Remarks about caution made Julian think again about the incident with the pigeons, and when Catherine was otherwise occupied, he sought out Richard. "I didn't say anything to anyone, Richard, but I was still disturbed over the supposed accidental shot last week. I had to do my best to find out the direction it came from, because the boy was so insistent that it was not him. Matthew is not afraid to admit when he's done something wrong, and he said he was not shooting in Catherine's direction at all. He said there were no pigeons in that area, but rather they were fluttering down from the roof of the empty wing. Well, that's the other direction entirely. He would have had no reason to shoot towards Catherine's area, and when I questioned him further, he told me the shot went right over his head. This is when I began to think that it was indeed intentional, and that perhaps it was gotten off by someone who was hiding around the house." "Who did you have in mind?" Richard asked, sensing that it was not the end of the story. "Well, of course we all thought of Catherine's father, as did you, but the more I pondered that, the more incongruous it seemed. If you could have seen Blake's face when I gave him the purse, he surely knows if he ever came back here and I discovered it, my wrath would know no bounds, and I'd order him to return the money. Edward's father, of course, is another matter. I thought of Reginald then, and I went to see him and when Jennifer and Catherine were in town. I told him that he was still under suspicion concerning the death of my brother, and now with this incident with Catherine, wondered if he was making a habit of shooting at my family." "Julian!" I know. 'Tis highly unlikely it was Reginald either, but sometimes when one is accused, one tends to bring out information that would have otherwise been kept silent. I thought perhaps he knew who the culprit was, or at least had an idea. I've always felt this way about Reginald, that he knows more than he tells about many things, although I confess I do not know why." "Did he have anything useful to say?" "No, he merely swore to God that he had no hand in it, and said again that Robert's death could not be laid at his feet, as he was not the murderer. I don't think a staunch Puritan such as he would swear to God and then lie. In fact, some of the most radical boldly declare what they have done and claim they were executing God's wrath. Anyway, I went on to ask if he had any idea who might be responsible, and he said that he didn't, but I noticed he could not meet my eyes, and he was frowning as if troubled by something. I still say he knows more than he's ever told about Robert's death." "It's frustrating," Richard agreed, "particularly when there may be information just under the surface that you cannot draw out of a person. I doubt he fired the shot, though. I don't think so either. We must go on looking for another answer to these mysteries." Later that evening, when most of the household were changing for supper, Catherine came upon Julian strolling through the garden. He was near the ivy-covered door, and appeared to be deep in thought. "Ah, are we both out at dusk, then?" he said when he saw her, pacing around, trying to get things off our minds. Catherine smiled and answered, "Sometimes I become restless and agitated thinking about my father. It helps to walk in the fresh air. I fear my overstimulated mind has become too quick to seize on actions or words that are nothing more than the normal comings and goings of a household. I translate them into something else due to my own suspicions. You are right about me. I must stop thinking every noise and shadow is my father. Julian was unsure what to say, as he had reached a point where he simply did not know how to reassure her or even convince himself that she was ultimately wrong. But he told her once again that her father would never be allowed near here. Yet he must have plans to try to take Matthew and Clarissa back. Look how he tried to retrieve me after Robert's death, and I was no longer a child, and indeed a widow. Why is he so complacent about children who are still legally his to control? Julian sighed wearily. I fear once again I've not done right by you, Kathy. It is often difficult to determine if it's in one's best interest to know the truth. Perhaps I will just ask you to take my word for this. If Blake has been on the property, I don't think it's to try to take the children. How can you know this? He looked at her for what seemed like a long time and then said, I paid your father to leave them with me. I gave him a substantial sum for his word that he would never not attempt to take them, as well as permanently leave that area. In other words, he relinquished his rights to them. Julian finished. He couldn't imagine her reaction. Would she be angry? Would she rage at him for daring to buy children as one would buy a horse or a painting? He had no way to predict how she would feel, and of course saw no flicker of emotion on her face. Finally, she turned and looked over the fields as if processing his words. He sold his children? She said blankly. I'm sorry, sweetheart. Perhaps it was a terrible sin to go about it that way, but God forgive me, I didn't care. I wanted them out of his clutches, and that seemed the easiest way to acquire them with least trouble. It worked, too. It's part of the reason I'm so sure it's not him hanging around the palace. Part of the bargain was that he leave the area, and I gave him ample money to live on until he could establish himself somewhere. I doubt he would want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. I guess I should have known I couldn't hide it forever, though, and that one day you would have to know why he was so willing to surrender them without a fierce fight. I hope you can forgive me. I only sought to bring them here and settle the matter, and I'm afraid I didn't care how. Although Catherine knew her father was her character, it still angered her that he so willingly turned over his children to a virtual stranger for money. But they are here, she thought. He knew what to do, and he acted quickly. It's part of what I love about him. Oh, Julian, she said, turning around to him, just hold me. Momentarily surprised, yet filled with relief, he gathered her in his arms. She didn't hold it against him and had turned to him for comfort. In that moment, he could have asked for more. They don't ever have to know, do they? She asked earnestly. I wouldn't dream of it, love, Julian replied, pulling her closer. I merely told them that I frightened him off. So the rest is our secret and shall remain so. Catherine left the supper table that night, feeling as every emotion within her showed on her face. Alone in her room, she stared out toward the darkness, catching just the faintest glow of fires in the groom's quarters, and tried to make out various objects under the full moon. As she had done once before when staring out a window in another place for another reason, she whispered her thoughts out loud. I am in love with him. I can no longer deny it. And it was not a mere physical attraction. His heart and soul were beautiful too. She knew that now. The next day Rose sought out Catherine to tell her she had a visitor. She thanked her and quickly made her way to the parlor, wondering who would be calling at that time of the day. She was completely unprepared to see Christopher standing there, smiling broadly, and she threw her arms into his. I told that pleasant maid to say you had a caller. I wanted you to be surprised, and apparently she did, as I asked, he said mischievously. I cannot believe it's you standing here. He was horrified to hear the story of Robert's death, and how she had traveled to France only to find their aunt was dead, and of their own subsequent illness. But I wrote to you last year, Kathy, several letters, and suddenly Catherine heard a noise and turned to see Julian, who had just entered the room. You are home, she cried. Julian, this is Christopher. He's just arrived from London. I'll have to explain. She was smiling so beautifully at him that she felt his heart was leaping, was being crushed as he stood there. Christopher offered his hand, but Julian stared at him without moving. The name escaped him entirely, and he could only think how attractive the young man was, for immediately he recognized him as the one he had seen in the woods with Catherine on that long-ago day before all their lives were shattered. At last you have come to take her away, then? This is what I feared. Whatever is between you has been over for some time, hasn't it? So why not leave her here with us? Her child is the heir to Briarwood. What of that? Kathy, Christopher said, looking at her in complete bewilderment. I apologize for my brother-in-law, Christopher. He makes sport of assigning false motives to people, thinking the worst of me was once his favorite pastime, and apparently did still it on occasion. She turned to Julian and finished with, all while insisting he loves me. Julian began to speak, but she quietly silenced him. Julian, I would like you to meet my brother, Christopher. Now I think I will leave you two to get better acquainted while I go find Christopher. And then, turning again to Julian, and said, and far better chance at character judgment. With that she went out and closed the door behind her with a definite click that was far more effective than if she had slammed it in anger. Julian suddenly saw Christopher's face falling into the familiar lines of the Trefalners' outstanding good looks, and inwardly shook his head at the ridiculous mistake. To his surprise, Christopher began to laugh when Catherine closed the door. Well, friend, if it's one thing I know, it's my sister, and she has left you to entertain me to purposely cause you discomfort. She can be quick to retaliate when the mood strikes. Thankfully, it doesn't strike very often. Do you anger her much this way? He asked, still smiling. Much, replied Julian dryly, and I appreciate the fact that you can address me as a friend after my tirade. The two sat down as they continued speaking. I always find such situations amusing rather than something at which to make offense. You will need it. You'll find I'm much like her in that respect. We both laugh heartily at this world and prefer to avoid conflict. But I will tell you something. She wants you to have a good opinion of her, or it would not have angered her so to find that you believed me an old lover. And that I do, but my heart would have broken if you were someone to take her from me. I shouldn't survive it, he added, as Luce came in with the brandy. When she left, Julian said any day could be the end with her. As I said, there hasn't been much I've done to anger her this past year. I admit my intentions are to marry her, but as far as her intentions, who can tell? The men laughed, and Julian went on. Why did she not go to you after Robert's death? She didn't know where I was. If she had, she would not have come to death's door. I sent correspondence here as soon as she was married, but apparently it never arrived. Ironically, in one of them, I told her about our aunt died. She would never have sent it out if it had arrived. Oh well, what's done is done. I should have been better at sending messages all along, but I'm afraid I wasn't. I wished to avoid bringing her into anything intrigue, so I wrote as little as possible. Her husband, young as you, of course, it would not have occurred to me that she would be in need. His death was a tragedy for which I am obviously sorry for you both. Thank you. It was particularly sad, as they never have been able to solve it. I thought we would reach old age together. There are days I still cannot believe he is gone. I did try to make Catherine stay after his death, but we did not get along well at first, which was my fault entirely. I pleaded with her in the end. However, she was determined to go. Devil or angels would not have stopped her. Although Julian was engaged in the conversation Through it all, there was an undercurrent in his consciousness. More messages, I'm to believe, disintegrated into thin air. There could no longer be any doubt that someone was behind it, and for a specific reason. The two men sat sipping brandy and watching the fading light. Then suddenly